Since I've recently started my own podcast, I thought it might be a good idea to listen to what else is out there. So I picked one, almost at random, that seemed like it might be interesting. And it was. But then, out of the blue, the presenter said something quite extraordinary. I'll play it for you.
Another way of thinking about this is, say you click on one video of a Jordan Peterson talk. Jordan Peterson, Canadian far-right psychiatrist? What is he?
Pseudo-intellectual?
Yeah.
Psychologist, I think.
Dangerous individual. Very popular on YouTube.
My ears had picked up at the mention of Jordan Peterson, and I was left frankly dumbfounded by the way that his life's work had not only been so misrepresented, but that it had been done so casually. Like I say, it was extraordinary. In fact, it was so extraordinary that I had to listen to it again.
Another way of thinking about this is, say you click on one video of a Jordan Peterson talk. Jordan Peterson, Canadian far-right psychiatrist? What is he?
Pseudo-intellectual?
Yeah.
Psychologist, I think.
Dangerous individual. Very popular on YouTube.
I mean, this wasn't a hit piece on Peterson. Neither even was it a probing interview. He was mentioned only in passing to illustrate the way that YouTube algorithms work. They weren't even attacking Peterson per se. But the way in which his 300 or so hours of nuanced content on YouTube, much of which is dedicated to guarding against extremism, from the right as much as from the left, was dismissed, was quite frankly shocking. So let's start with that. The accusation that he is
far-right.
So before we expand on that, it might be instructive to try and pin down what exactly
far-right
means. Wikipedia is the most obvious place to start, and they say far-right politics are politics further on the right of the left-right spectrum than the standard political right, particularly in terms of extreme nationalism, nativist ideologies and authoritarian tendencies. The term is often used to describe Nazism, neo-Nazism, fascism, neo-fascism and other ideologies or organisations that feature ultra-nationalist, chauvinist, xenophobic, racist, anti-communist or reactionary views. These can lead to oppression and violence against groups of people based on their supposed inferiority or their perceived threat to the native ethnic group, nation, state or ultra-conservative traditional social institutions. Now, rather than blindly defending him in the spirit of impartiality and maybe even good journalism, why don't we let the man speak for himself?
Speak to me about the psychology of people receiving your views and immediately going to the analogy of Hitler.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very straightforward, and it happens to me all the time. But it's understandable. I am not a fan of the radical left, and I'm not a fan of
It's understandable they do it, or it's understandable one can analyze what they're doing?
Well, both. I mean, the reason that they do it is because, let's say that you have adopted a postmodern Marxist view of the world, and that you think that dividing people into their collective identities and viewing the world as a battleground between interest groups is the appropriate way of looking at the world. And reasonable. That's what a reasonable person would do. And I come along and say, look, not only is that unreasonable, but it's very much akin to these murderous doctrines that did tens of millions of people in the 20th century. Okay, but you hold that viewpoint. Now you have, you don't have very many options under those circumstances. If I'm reasonable, you have to contend with my argument. If I'm not reasonable, then you can just categorize me as not reasonable and ignore me. And the best way to categorize me as not reasonable is to assume that I'm on the farthest end of the political spectrum away from you as possible, along with the reprehensible Nazis and the alt-right types, and just assume that that's me. The problem is it's not me. And if it was me, I would have been taken down 2 years ago. And the proof that it's not me is that I have 300 hours of lectures online from my entire academic career, and I haven't said a single thing that anyone has ever found that's even remotely associated with a radical right-wing viewpoint. And quite the contrary. I don't like identity politics at all. And I don't care if the leftists are doing it or the right-wingers are doing it. It's reprehensible in my estimation.
Now, interestingly enough, in this very same podcast, Wired boast about their investigative journalistic prowess.
So what we did is we analysed the start and end dates of 147 former Revolut employees on LinkedIn as a way of gauging how long people were staying at the company. We found out that over 80% of them had lasted for less than a year, and over half had stayed at the company for less than 6 months. If you compare that to the average tenure of a startup employee, that's between 18 months and 4 years. So it's worth saying that this is not necessarily fully representative, and it's very hard to get an accurate gauge. In fact, Revolut didn't really respond to our request for that information.
So firstly, Wired, I'd put your money where your mouth is and find something that marks him out as
far right
before making such a claim. Now, onto the charge of Peterson being a
what is he?
Pseudo-intellectual?
Yeah.
Just let that sink in for a minute. An eminent professor and best-selling author has been called a
what is he?
Pseudo-intellectual?
Yeah.
What about Peterson's credentials and achievements? Well, after graduating high school, he attended the University of Alberta, where he gained a BA in political science. After a gap year visiting Europe, he then spent time studying the Cold War, with reference to totalitarianism in the 20th century, before returning to the University of Alberta and received another degree in psychology. He then went to McGill University in Montreal to gain a PhD, this time in clinical psychology, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the attached Douglas Hospital there. He then moved to Massachusetts in the United States, where he worked and taught at Harvard University, i.e. the world's most prestigious and highest rated university, according to the Center for World University Ranking, as an assistant and associate professor in psychology, before returning to Canada as a full professor at the University of Toronto, the 17th highest rated university in the world. During most of this time, he ran an active clinical practice, authored or co-authored over 100 academic papers, and has been cited over 8,000 times. In addition to his academic and professional career, he has written 2 best-selling books and regularly sells out many thousand-seat stadia around the world. Now, I don't subscribe to the notion that experts cannot be challenged, no matter how eminent. After all, I'm a 51-year-old plumber, and I'm challenging professional journalists. Still, whilst labelling Peterson as a
what is he?
Pseudo-intellectual?
Yeah.
is not the worst thing that he said about him here. It is definitely the most incorrect. An intellectual is one who engages in critical thinking, research and reflection about society, proposes solutions for its normative problems, and gains authority as a public figure. Pseudo is usually an adjectival prefix meaning not genuine, spurious, or sham, according to Google's online dictionary. Funnily enough, in that very same dictionary, the example they use is, we are talking about real journalists and not the pseudo kind, which is kind of ironic. So let's look at the last accusation, that he is, and I quote,
dangerous individual.
A dangerous individual. Dangerous to whom, I wonder? Well, to the uninitiated. The completely uninitiated, I mean, because that statement would be enough, and is probably intended to prevent many morally incurious souls from ever listening to a word he says. But perhaps Peterson is dangerous, but not in the way they think, because he is dangerous to those who hold these tin pot and frankly half-baked ideas about identity politics. He probably is dangerous to Justin Trudeau and the rest of the Canadian government. He's definitely very dangerous to those who promote compelled speech. But perhaps we can take a little sample of his dangerous and vile ideas from some of the chapter titles of his bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. His famous "Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world," often shortened to "clean your room," in which he encourages us to make our little corner of the world, no matter how modest, just a little better. Or the revolutionary "Tell the truth," or at least don't lie. And I'd hope any further explanations to be superfluous on that one. Be precise in your speech, which you think all the hypersensitive millennial snowflake types would be applauding. Or how about compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not who someone else is today, which is only standard sage advice from any self-help guru worth his salt. Or my personal favourite, do not bother children when they are skateboarding, which, in its unobvious and roundabout way, just encourages us to be suspicious of people's declared aims, to look beneath their cuddly words and discover their real motives for the things that they do. Only in today's topsy-turvy world of social justice, poor me victimhood, could such solid and self-evidently sensible principles ever be described as dangerous. It's hard to take his critics as serious actors when in the very same podcast they warn of the dangers of blindly believing and then parroting what they've heard on the internet.
So when they hear a story like this, they immediately overreact, and it actually causes a lot more harm than good.
And what's especially weird about this is it started on Facebook with people sharing something without verifying it, and then it was, I think, Mail Online and The Sun newspapers in the UK that picked it up and wrote about how viral it was going on Facebook and the panic it was causing. But that was then fed back into the Facebook sort of feedback machine, weird algorithmic loop, and caused the hysteria to go even bigger. And then everyone started writing about it, and only a couple of people actually looked at it properly, sensibly, understood what was happening, and explained what was going on. So all you were getting is just more and more people shrieking, "Won't somebody think of the children?" when actually they didn't really have a clue what was going on, and they were all essentially being hoodwinked by the same blind hysteria. And that's kind of problematic.
Because they quite clearly know little of the man, aside from his besmirched reputation. As he himself says, when you get accused of being both a Nazi and a Jewish shill in the same day, you know you're doing something right. But having picked out this podcast at random and knowing nothing about Wired, I thought, well, it's not as if it's a massive publication or anything. And then I looked it up. Been going over 25 years. Started in San Francisco and regularly posts in the top 500 of the Alexa list, which I discovered is a list of the world's most visited websites. And then I looked up the most visited technology websites. It came in at number 3 in the world. And so this is what passes for journalism in the third most popular technology publication worldwide. So it's not as if they had any kind of responsibility, is it? So rather than focusing, as they would like, on the far right and pseudo-intellectual, I then decided to look up what, in point of fact, a journalist is, to try and get a handle on that. And where better to go, the National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct. Code 2 states that a journalist strives to ensure that information disseminated is honestly conveyed, accurate and fair. Code 3 does his or her utmost to correct harmful inaccuracies. Code 4, a journalist differentiates between fact and opinion. But then perhaps they're not NUJ members. If that's the case, maybe we could go to IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation, a body to which Wired magazine is a signatory. Their editor's code on accuracy states, the press must take care not to publish inaccurate, misleading or distorted information or images, including headlines not supported by the text. A significant inaccuracy, misleading statement or distortion must be corrected promptly with due prominence and, where appropriate, an apology published. In cases involving IPSO, due prominence should be as required by the regulator. And point 4 is the press, while free to editorialise and campaign, must distinguish clearly between comment, conjecture and fact. So if Peterson is a dangerous far-right pseudo-intellectual, then what does it say about his casual and dismissive accusers? To be dangerous, one must cause harm. Is it dangerous to suggest that people might gain some satisfaction and may even make the world a better place if they take responsibility for themselves and shoulder the burden they should? that they might progress, find meaning, contentment, and even happiness in doing such a thing? Or does that make you far right? Or is it just rejecting the label of victim that earns you that pejorative label? Or is it dangerous, rather, to peddle untruths as if they were, in fact, fact? And if that is dangerous, isn't it more dangerous to do the same thing when you run the third most visited technology website on the planet? Pseudo-intellectual? How about pseudo-journalists?